Hello and welcome to part 2 of my Whitechapel crime policing and the inner city revision videos. In this section I'm going to look at the local context of Whitechapel in this time period. So there are a number of key features of Whitechapel at this time period, which included overcrowded accommodation, which led to the associated problems and crimes of theft, personal property and domestic abuse. Work was unreliable, there was higher scale unemployment. This led to more theft, more stealing and disruptive behaviour. Prostitution was rife in Whitechapel. This led to assaults on women and gangs operating in the area, intimidating women. Alcohol was another big feature of Whitechapel at this time, which led to disorder on the streets, especially around the pubs and gin palaces. Workhouses led to crimes like theft committed by people so desperate not to go to the workhouse that they would rather turn to crime, and orphans who turned to petty crimes and begging rather than go to these workhouses. Immigration was another key feature of Whitechapel too. There were tensions and violence between long-established residents and the Irish and Jewish immigrants. So pollution and poor sanitation were a key feature of Whitechapel too. So Whitechapel was in the East End of London and was an area of extreme poverty at this time. London itself was a heavily polluted city, and the prevailing wind carried smoke and gas into the East End. This often combined with fog to create smog, and at times it wasn't even possible to see your hand in front of your face. The streets, or many of them, were like a maze. Sanitation was poor, there was little healthy drinking water, and sewers ran into the street. Coupled with this were key features of housing in Whitechapel. The majority, but not all housing, was in overcrowded slum areas, which were also known as rookeries. These were houses that were divided into several apartments so that up to 30 people could be packed into one apartment, sharing beds that were densely packed together with outside toilets that were unhygienic. Families indeed lived on the brink of starvation. In short, in this accommodation, rents were cheap but conditions were very poor. Flower and Dean Street is an example of a rookery, and the 1871 census said that there were 902 lodgers living in just 31 doss houses on this street alone. It had a reputation as being a haunt for thieves, drunkards and prostitutes, and showed as a semi-criminal area on Booth's poverty map. Accommodation was also offered in lodging houses. There are about 200 of these just in Whitechapel. Some of these operated in 8-hour shifts, so that 3 people could use each bed per day. Residents would leave to try and earn enough money for the next night. These were very unhygienic, but about a quarter of the population of Whitechapel lived in these. But it was an area of contrast too. In 1881, the census said there was a population of 30,709 in just 4,069 houses. But whilst a wealthy household might contain a family of 4 and their servants, a small house was shared by a family of 10 and multiple people lived within rookery apartments. The Peabody estate was an example of model housing. So this Whitechapel estate in East London was the first of 10 estates which Peabody built as part of London's earliest slum clearance programme. In 1875, the Metropolitan Board of Works was given compulsory purchase powers by Parliament. It looked for organisations which could replace the slums with model dwellings, and Peabody was among those chosen. Old maps showed that the site of the estate had previously been a maze of narrow courtyards filled with cramped and unhealthy houses. Peabody's architect, Henry Derbyshire, designed the 11 blocks to be built on the cleared land. Paid for by George Peabody, a wealthy American who had moved to London. The estate opened in 1881 and provided 286 flats. Within months it was visited by members of a select committee on housing who wanted to see the results of this 1875 legislation. Now weekly rents here started at 3 shillings, so 15p, for a one-room flat and went up to 6 shillings for 3 rooms. In 1910, more land was acquired and Block L was also added. But even these rents were too high for most locals, who were then thrown out when they got behind with their rent, which in turn led to more overcrowding elsewhere. But finally, we can look at work and the workhouses. So many Whitechapel residents worked in small, dark, overcrowded and dusty sweatshops in trades such as shoemaking, tailoring and matchmaking. Hours were very long and wages were very low. Others worked maybe in railway construction or in the London docks, but the amount of work available varied from day to day, and so this left families without a steady income. Workhouses, these were public institutions in which the destitute of a parish received board and lodging in return for work. Now, the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act previously said that the deserving poor received some support called outdoor relief, but the Act abolished this. The poor would therefore only receive support if they moved to the workhouse. Now, those unable to afford a lodging house or who were too young, old or ill to work could go into the workhouse. But the Whitechapel workhouse, which was at South Grove, was very much a last resort because the rules were strict and families were kept apart. Inmates earned their bed through hard labour.